Wanted to just briefly introduce Dr. Jones, our lunch keynote speaker today from the Mayo Clinic, who has a fairly new title and quite a cool one as well. So Director of AI in their Department of Neurology. So with that, Dr. Jones, thank you. Welcome.
So great. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all of you for being here. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and my background and how I've come into this new position and kind of how we're thinking about leveraging artificial intelligence to heal neurologic illness. I am a behavioral neurologist, practicing clinician. And my passion and goals are always to help our patients. At Mayo, we say the needs of the patient come first. And in this new role, I want to then advocate for AI so that it can also heal our patients. I think that we see the promise that AI can do that. And in my new role, I want to do all that we can to facilitate that. We have over 100 neurologists just in Mayo Clinic Rochester, and we treat all forms of serious, complex neurologic illness. I did my medical training at Georgetown University in DC, did my internship there in internal medicine, went on to do neurology at Mayo Clinic, and I did a 2-year fellowship in quantitative neuroimaging before doing a behavioral neurology fellowship before coming on staff, where I now work as a clinician scientist. My interests are on dementia, multimodal neuroimaging. I'm a funded investigator as part of ADNI, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. Mayo Clinic is the core site for processing those neuroimages. So a lot of my background is feature engineering on images as part of that role. In particular, functional MRI, but also molecular PET, amyloid PET, FDG PET, glucose PET, structural MRI, infusing that data into models that tell us about Alzheimer's disease. Developed a pathophysiologic model of Alzheimer's disease called the cascading network failure model of Alzheimer's disease, which is a complex systems-based model. Use that to inform the features that we engineer. And that's what I do. I also work with a lot of colleagues on something called the Mayo Clinic Study of Aging, which is a population-based sampling. We follow longitudinally people from 30 to 90, over 6,000 people with multimodal neuroimaging, quantitative neuropsychometrics, genomics. We've got buildings full of blood and spinal fluid longitudinally, and all sorts of data that we've been collecting longitudinally over time. And we have a infrastructure in place and team of scientists that integrate all that data that we use in our studies. So when it came time to start to do this type of thing for neurology in general, this is the background that they were tapping when they put me in the role as artificial intelligence director for all of neurology. So not only thinking about my research in dementia, but the neurologic practice and neurologic disease in general. So just disclosures, I do have patents pending for some AI systems and methods and that we'll discuss in this work for classification and prediction, computer vision, interpretation of multivariate medical data. But I have a simple goal. It's just to describe how artificial intelligence can be used to enhance neurologic practice, how I think it can be, or what we're striving for. So why is Mayo Clinic turning this way? Why do we have this new position? So these are kind of what we've identified as an institution as some forces of change that are driving changes in the healthcare landscape. So accurate diagnosis anywhere, anytime. So people won't need to be traveling. They won't expect to be traveling to Rochester. They'll be wanting those diagnoses wherever they are. We think that that's going to happen in the future. It's a driver of change. The patient will see you now. Rise in consumerism. There's going to be more of a consumeristic expectations to the delivery of healthcare. Virtual interactions, have you seen today? Research, education, and collaborators are going to accelerate cures. I think that's what we're seeing here today. We see those as drivers of innovation moving forward. And old business models are going to become obsolete. So this is the changing healthcare landscape that Mayo Clinic sees, and we see AI as a response to many of these factors. It's not the only response, but it's an important response to this changing healthcare landscape. And instead of waiting for that landscape to change underneath our feet, we want to help drive that change. So that's why you'll see these new positions occurring in our department, like the directors of artificial intelligence for our different divisions. So rooted in values built by us. I mean, this is core to what we do. And as we collaborate with people, we try to make this clear. But the needs of the patients come first. We have a culture of respect, integrity, compassion, healing, teamwork, innovation, excellence, and stewardship. We have a mission to inspire hope, promote health through integrated clinical practice, education, and research. As I think about AI neurology, I want to think about this collaborative model that we've heard many times today, but you can't do this as a computer scientist expert. You can't do this with someone who knows a lot of math and statistics. You can't do this with somebody who practices a lot of neurology, knows a lot about our data. It has to be a team. And this team has to have individuals who know a little bit about all these things, but deep knowledge within one of these spheres, and willing to collaborate and work with others and learn about the other spheres. And together, that's how we're going to use AI to enhance the neurologic practice. So you guys don't need this, but you'll see why I'm introducing it in this way in a second. But so what is artificial intelligence? The theory and the development of computational systems able to observe data, perform intelligent tasks. Usually you say, well, what are intelligent tasks? They're like, well, the things that humans normally do. But you can, like vision perception, speech recognition, decision making, translation between languages. You can obviously think of intelligent things that humans can't do. Graphically, you get data coming in, you build some model, and you got some output task that performs an intelligent task. But I think this kind of punts the question when you're thinking about the definition. What you really need to define here is what is intelligence, not necessarily what is artificial about what we're doing. Is IQ intelligence, the intelligent quotient? You have someone do some tests on a piece of paper. We all know the flaw in that model. Because it doesn't test something like emotion, right? Well, why don't we add emotional quotient in there? Maybe that tells us what intelligence is and gives us a good number of it. Obviously think of flaws there. Your athletic intelligence quotient. How athletic are you? But there's some underlying theme to all these things that we're trying to capture. Task performance is part of it. So I turn to the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. What do they think intelligence is? So this is luckily declassified in 1995. So they may have a different definition now, I don't know. But this is a very short paper. It's fun to read. You can get it online. So the secret's crossed out now. It's no longer a secret. But the part of this I find interesting is they boil down this to what they call the triad: positive intelligence, political action, counterintelligence. So there's actions, but it's doing things, but also protecting yourself against things. Political actions, and then there's this application. It's not just those actions, but there's the process, the product, and the agency. So gathering the data, the people doing it, the modeling, the putting it together, and then thinking about how that reflects against the agent or the agency. So I like to put this together into a different definition of intelligence. Intelligence is the collection and processing of information about environments, which is needed by an agent to perform beneficial actions within those or related environments. And so then kind of casts AI as this whole process going from there's environmental data coming into some model, and then there's some output that can be used to perform some beneficial actions. And that whole process is intelligence. And when the agent who's actually using that to perform a beneficial action is the model itself, that's something unique. I don't think we see that with AI. AI doesn't quite do that. Humans do that. So when you put this type of model of intelligence, artificial is when the model is this cube, but turn that model into what we use to do this, our brains. That's true intelligence, or non-artificial, or general intelligence. The actual beneficial actions are used to sustain the model itself. And so that makes me break down environmental data that the brain is using in ways like, where's that data coming from that the brain's using? Inside the body or outside the body? Internal versus external? The world or the milieu, internal milieu? And then how does the brain model that data it's getting? Concretely or abstractly? So concretely for what it is, or does it combine it with things it knows and make something abstract, like the theory of relativity? What sort of model is that? And then how are you going to control the deployment of that model? How does the brain do that? What's the control mode? What's the feed forward? How's it going to respond to disturbances? Feedback and feed control mechanisms. And so the structures in the brain, which I think probably map onto these concepts, we have a way of deriving this from neuroimaging data. But these are the regions in the back of the brain. You can see also the hearing areas, but we're mostly visual beasts for the external world. And then the milieu from things like the front parts of the brain, the amygdala, things like that. And then the type of model, whether it's concrete versus abstract, there's probably different regions of the brain doing that. And then how you're controlling those models, different regions of the brain's doing that. You combine all those, and that's the model of intelligence. And so this will be a theme that I'll talk about when we talk about neurology and artificial intelligence. They're very complementary. As we learn more about artificial intelligence, we'll learn more about the mind. As we learn more about the mind, we'll learn more about artificial intelligence. As we learn more about neurologic disease, we'll learn more about these things as well. And I'll show you an example of what I mean here. So here's what you think of for the cube representing the AI task, mental functioning there, the way the brain does it. And then that's a PET scan, FDG PET scan on the end there, of a patient with a neurodegenerative disease. And here you see the AI task, natural language processing is what we call that. What's the mental function associated with that? Language. What's the neurodegenerative disease that attacks that ability? Something called primary progressive aphasia. So a patient has a selective degradation of that area of the mind performing that function. Then we talk about computer vision. We call that vision in humans. And then the condition which degrades that ability in the mind is called posterior cortical atrophy. Selectively targets your visual processing ability. Same thing, you can selectively impair your facial recognition, something called prosopagnosia. Your social skills can disappear selectively and targetedly in a condition called behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. You've heard a little bit about ALS, analogous to robotic motion. Your movement goes away. Your ability to control and coordinate motion, your praxis, robot planning. There's conditions called primary progressive apraxia, speech cortical basal syndrome, which will rob you of those abilities. Your cognitive map can disappear in something called topographic nausea. But the point is as we understand these neurodegenerative diseases, we'll understand the mental functions, it'll form AI, and we can use AI to help us do those things. And so when you think about face space representations, in convolutional neural networks, you think about deep neural networks, what they're teaching us about the brain. Deep neural networks have these layers, right? That's why we call them deep. And then you look at the brain, the data comes in the eyes from the external world, goes in the lateral geniculate, some areas of the brain, gets processed serially in this type of model. And how does the brain represent it? So a deep neural network would say, well, it kind of looks like the same architecture. So maybe the brain represents it this way. You get the readout from your last layer, see. Or is it some other way, a simpler way, a face space described by eigenvectors or something, some combination of features? Well, researchers have put electrodes in the face areas of the brain, and then they presented faces and said, well, which face space is this? Certainly not, doesn't look like a deep neural network. No surprise to anyone. Maybe it is, I don't know. But face images can be linear reconstructed using about 200 face cells in the brain. So it builds a face space, more akin to simpler algorithms like eigenfaces or something like that, not a deep neural network. And so facial identity is encoded in a very simple neural code. So I think that's an important piece of information, because these deep neural networks break. They break in a way that human brains don't break. I showed you earlier the way the human brains break. This doesn't break my brain when you put glasses on Reese Witherspoon. I don't think it's Russell Crowe. I'm pretty good, so I don't. And you can't give me a neurodegenerative disease that'll break my brain in that way either. But it's pretty easy to break a deep neural network this way with adversarial attack. It doesn't see the way you and I see. And we don't really know what it's doing. And that lack of interpretability is a big problem for medical applications. So this stop sign, as it becomes, face recognition is fun, but what about a medical decision or driving? This stop sign, put it into a black box. Some model, it's actually the black box, and it tells you it's a speed limit sign, 45 miles per hour. That's no good. So that's a problem with getting overly reliant on deep neural networks in the clinical workflow. It's not something that are uninterpretable. It needs to be thought about carefully before we do something like that. Anyone, what's the answer here? So everybody can read that, no problem. You're missing a lot of data there. And that might break a neural network, I don't know, depends on how you train it. Certainly certain models it would break. It doesn't break your brain, but someone with posterior cortical atrophy, this will definitely break their brain. They can't see this. Someone has a neurodegenerative disease, they won't be able to put together the gestalt with those missing pieces. That's telling us something about the architecture of the mind, and it should inform the way you're building a neural network if you want to replicate the mind. Just to give you a little bit about what we do in neurology and how you can use AI, this is an important thing to understand a neurologic patient and what we think about as neurologists. It's all about pattern recognition. I'll play this video if I can get it to play.
The man went over the hill to find his jug,
Can anybody hear that?
but he wasn't there. Found the jug
So I hear this speech.
hiding under the table.
I heard that speech. This
Okay,
patient
very good.
came to my office.
And, could you show me how you blow out a candle? Okay, and could you cough 3 times?
I can't do that.
Okay, can you?
So I asked him if he could cough 3 times. He said, I can't do that. That's all the information I needed. I heard him speak like that. I asked him to cough. He said, I can't. And then I knew that this had been going on for 8 years. Those are the only 3 pieces of information I needed to give this man an accurate diagnosis. Does anyone know what condition he has? So he has something called primary progressive apraxia of speech. And that's a very easy and quick diagnosis, if you've heard that before. And so what that tells you is that's ripe for AI. If I can do that quickly, I can train an algorithm to do that quickly. I train a resident to do that pretty quickly. Right now, you probably have to come to Mayo Clinic for that diagnosis, to be honest. He was seen by multiple neurologists throughout the country over 8 years. They thought he had ALS. But if I could develop an app to listen to that voice and say, at Mayo Clinic, they would say he has apraxia of speech, that would have saved him heartache over 8 years of being diagnosed with ALS. That's something that I think machine learning can do. So if the neurologist can do it, we can find those patterns. There's going to be a way to train AI to do it. Now, if you think that there's something hidden in the data that we've never seen before, I think AI could probably do that too. But it's going to be harder. It's going to require bigger data. It's going to be less interpretable. Those aren't the early wins. Those aren't the big wins that we're looking for at this point, but they will be there. But you have to design a way to use AI in neurology that captures both of these types of things. This type of thing is an early win. So here's another example. So here's your training data. I don't know if you guys can see this, but so here's your input, 0. This person's normal. That's their image. This is 1. That person has Alzheimer's disease. So you see the hippocampi severely atrophic. So now you guys are trained. What do these two people have? Do they both have Alzheimer's disease? Vote. Raise your hand. How many people think they both have Alzheimer's disease? Neither have Alzheimer's disease? One of them? We don't know. But the hippocampi are severely atrophic. I think an algorithm that relies on hippocampal volume, this structure here, is going to tell you they have Alzheimer's disease. Neither of them do. They both have amnestic mild cognitive impairment, maybe Alzheimer's disease, maybe amnestic dementia even. But here's other imaging modalities that we could look at. This looks at the tau protein. In this person with Alzheimer's disease, you can see the tau protein in red everywhere. You see the amyloid protein everywhere. But in these two cases who look structural imaging, clinically they look like Alzheimer's, structurally they look like Alzheimer's. They don't have any amyloid or tau in their brain. So most people aren't going to tell you that. Most deep learning algorithms or whatever you want to do is going to have really dirty labels calling all those things Alzheimer's disease. You need high quality data that doesn't make those types of errors. You need to work with people with domain knowledge who have high quality data and understanding of these disease processes. So this is from our paper called Tau Negative Amnestic Dementia Masquerades as Alzheimer's Disease. This has led to a new definition of a new condition that we call late now, but it's not really rebranding of a condition. So that just tells you about, if we want to do neurology, we need AI in neurology, we need to have the computer science, we need the math, the statistics, but you need to partner with people with domain knowledge like Ravi was talking about. So here's an FDG PET scan. I know a lot about these, to the point where people email me these images and they say, can you look at this? What do you think of it? And before I would give them an answer, I would say, I would try to predict the person's age. I would say, wait, is this person 65? And if they said yes or somewhere in the ballpark, I'd say, okay, I'm going to give you a good prediction. And since I could do that really well, I knew I could train an algorithm to also predict the age, and we did that. So I trained in Mayo data, and then looked at ADNI data, which is multi-site study, and said, can I use just the PET scan to predict people's age? Yep, I can. We can actually predict a lot of stuff with the FDG PET scan. I can predict their Brock neurofibrillary tangle stage, all sorts of stuff. So other places where we have a lot of deep domain knowledge is in a lot of, not just imaging, which I think AI is important for, or voice recognition, which AI is important for in neurology, but also neurologists look at lots of stuff and make decisions, like the EEG, brain waves. We understand the mind, do neuropsychometric testing. We're really good at segmenting data from the mind and producing features. We look at EMGs. We look at time series from muscles. We look at time series physiologic data from nerves. Every function that the humans do affects the neurologic practice, and there's usually some readout, physiologic readout, that neurologists judge with their eyes. This is where AI can help. So what happens when you partner with people like Google, with leaders in healthcare, like the CDC, now in Mayo, so I made this slide before them, but at this point it was originally at the CDC. What do you get? You get Google Flu Trends, right? Anybody remember Google Flu Trends? Anybody? So don't forget Google Flu Trends. It's great. Detecting influenza epidemics using search engine query data. It's wonderful. So what the flu is going to be like next year? Should you be getting that flu shot? Just ask Google Flu Trends. So they could fit this data. So here's what they fit, and then it's fit over here. There's their prediction. They can predict the flu. So let's go to their website. You can go to google.org, flu trends. Uh-oh, it's broken. Thank you for stopping by. Google flu trends and Google Da Nang trends are no longer publishing results. So something happened. So the parable of Google flu, traps in big data analysis. The model drifted. Whatever it was using as input no longer reflected what it wanted to give as an output. So drift is a big problem. They use search engines to do this, and people search for different things, or if there was a H1N1 scare that would change the way people would search, which is going to change the prediction. And also, another thing to think about is people, if they start to learn that this is a thing, maybe they start searching for Google flu trends more, right? Just itself. So and that's the problem with this. Once you actually deploy an algorithm into the wild starts to know the algorithm's there, and then the wild starts changing, and then the algorithm doesn't work anymore. So applied AI. AI has enhanced social media, right? So this is my Facebook page. That's my mom. And it finds her face, labels her, but it calls her Arlie Jones. That's not my mom's name. But it also labels this guy over here. Oh, that's my dad. His name is Arlie Jones. This is an easy error for me to figure out because I know my parents share the same Facebook account, right? So that's why I made that error. No problem, not a real error. But I have a lot of domain knowledge about my parents, so that's an interpretable result for me. Interpretability and domain knowledge, that's the point there. Those are important. So when I want to do AI-enhanced neurology, I told you a little about PET scans, but what we're working on is predictive analytics and diagnostics and something like that. So we'd say, well, this is a 55-year-old brain for an individual with mild Alzheimer's disease, dementia, 98% probability of that. They're going to have a 15-year disease course, 85% probability of that. They're not going to respond to acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like you think they might. Amyloid, if I looked for amyloid, it's going to be there, 99% probability. If you look for tau, it's going to be there, 97% probability. You're going to want to know that thing. You want to know if TDP43 is there or not. Because if you're enrolling someone in clinical trials that target one of these things, you're going to want to know if they're there or not. And then you can also say that this person is going to be functionally limited by language in a few months. That's going to be the primary cognitive domain that they're going to have trouble with. Start training them on that now. Start training the family on that now. This is the way that we think an early win will be something like this. This isn't in existence. We think we can do this. That's the way I think AI can enhance the neurologic practice. Another example, I think Ravi alluded to some of this work that Greg Worrell's lab is doing, predicting seizures and then using that to determine how to abort seizures. There's some FDA approval to do this in 10 patients right now. But I'm running a little bit out of time here. But wanted to make an important point about data size and model performance. People are probably familiar with this graph, but model performance goes up this way and then data size this way. So large neural networks with lots of data perform really well. But with not a lot of data, down here, traditional machine learning works better. And in neurology, I can guarantee you most of the time you're going to live down there with the amount of data that you have. So you can stick neural networks on it, but you should first prove that this didn't work better. So another problem, the fact that the data may not exist, is the upfront computation. We can solve that. But the poor interpretability of those models is a real problem. And so here's kind of my guiding mantra, a quote from this paper recently published in Nature, using unsupervised word embeddings to capture latent knowledge from material science literature. They could just search through abstracts in the physical sciences and chemistry literature. And from those well-curated abstracts, not all abstracts, they could reconstruct the periodic table and predict when a certain chemical compound was going to be discovered to have certain properties. But But why it worked was the high, and they actually studied this. If they had less quality corpus that they learned from, it fell apart. And so this didn't require big data. And so they say, contrary to what might seem like the conventional machine learning mantra, throwing more data at the problem is not always the solution. Instead, the quality and domain specificity of the corpus determine the utility of the embeddings for domain-specific tasks. This is the mantra that I have for Mayo Clinic Neurology. We have extremely high-quality data, very domain-specific, and we can leverage that to do these types of AI applications. And this just goes to show you should always test to make sure a simpler model wouldn't do as good. But this was one neuron versus a deep learning in aftershock prediction. They get the same result that they got out of a deep neural network from just one neuron. They didn't test that beforehand. That would be, you should look for a simpler answer before going to a more complicated, uninterpretable one. Just as saying that again, if you want to go end-to-end, ignore all this domain knowledge for feature engineering that you'd have to do before your neural network, you need lots of data. If you don't have that, you need people who know how to do this feature engineering and understand it. So quickly, out of time here, just go through some barriers. Data silos, big barrier. Proprietary file formats, different file formats for all this data that I talked about, this EEGs, different manufacturers. How do we get access for the proper feature engineering? It exists there, here. How do we marry it all together in the Mayo Clinic cloud, which is what we're working on with Google? That's a big issue. Data fusion in the cloud, multimodal. Cross-disciplinary education, people with neurologic background understanding machine learning and vice versa. Interpretability, intellectual debt when you move forward without that interpretability. Drift, as we mentioned, and big data itself may not be available, poorly or superficially annotated, lack interpretability. How do we commercialize this? What about privacy? Bias in your algorithms, depending on how you're learning and training. And then the regulatory oversight. So there's a couple barriers. But I think we can get over this. Obviously, we can get over this. And it's going to transform healthcare. And it's going to really help our patients. We're very excited about it. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but the FDA is thinking about this. How do we regulate this? This is their proposed regulatory framework for modifications to AI-based software as a medical device. This isn't their regulation. This is out for comment. You can comment and say what you think about it. But they're treating AI and ML as software for medical devices. But there's unique challenges. And that's this total product lifestyle regulation that they want. AI changes. When does it change so much that you decide that has to go to pre-market review again? Versus, well, we submitted a plan to the FDA beforehand that said if we change in these ways and have these validation steps, we don't need another pre-market review. They have, I think, a nice way to work that out. It seems very reasonable, but it's still in flux. So just to sum up, this is our approach at Mayo. We're partnering. You may have heard about our partnership with Google, partnerships with the UIUC. But we want to make sure the Mayo culture is involved in this collaborative nature. The needs of the patient are always at the center of what we're doing. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Figures, we got one back here.
This might be a little different, but specific to your background, I guess. Do you think fMRI can be used to diagnose neurological conditions or psychiatric conditions? Do you think AI could help with that? If humans can't recognize enough patterns, maybe machine learning or deep learning could.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's the question that given me my expertise, right? I've been banging my head up against spatial data and time series data from functional MRI in patients with various conditions for a decade. And I do have a biomarker based on that you can download from ADNI. It's called the network failure quotient. Can't be used on a single subject level. It tells us about the disease process and the pathophysiology at the group level. I think we will get there at the individual level too. It requires longer scanning time than anyone's willing to do in the clinical setting. So in ADNI, our scanning time is like 6 minutes. Not enough data. More like 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes of an fMRI scan. So you're going to have to think about the clinical situation where you're going to want to do that. We do that for PET scans. We'll scan people that long. We'll do that with a bunch of other MRI sequences. We'll scan them that long. But we're going to have to scan people for a longer time, have cleverer metrics. Deep learning, I think, will help. But you'll need more data.
Hi, Dr. Jones. Yeah, my question is, you mentioned just a few barriers, mostly a lot of things about data and privacy and other things. You didn't mention the current AI, machine learning algorithms, the deep learning technologies. You think those are good enough for now? Or like Dr. Lyer's the team need to actually invent a new algorithm or new stuff with this, or?
I think that's a great question. I think some of the things that Ravi has put forward, I think, are very important, and those types of new approaches, the Bayesian learning and graphical models with the deep neural networks, and because that has some causal structure in it, right? So what most of the data that the models are missing is they're very naive. They don't know why. So being able to understand why, meaning causal inference is embedded in the model in some way, that's probably the future for algorithmic development. Having causal structure in the models is really missing.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question about the interpretability that you were talking about. So in some of the models, the traditional machine learning models, you have a lot of good interpretability, but there's not much accuracy, like for complex problems. On the other hand, for deep learning, you don't have much interpretability, but you have really good results in terms of accuracy. So it seems to be there's some sort of trade-off between accuracy and interpretability. Now, even as human beings, if we are trying to look at images or anything, we have some sort of non-declarative features which we use to take decisions. So is that not a way of even real intelligence being uninterpretable but giving good results? So my question is, at what point do you start to trade off accuracy for interpretability?
There's certainly a role, and I think now there's a role for that. You are accumulating intellectual debt, as you start to have some uninterpretable algorithm deployed in your clinic, and it becomes integral to your practice, and then it breaks, or the underlying landscape of medicine changes. What's happening to your model, you may not know. There may be a series of dependencies built in at that point. And we do that all the time. Intellectual debt exists everywhere in medicine. But you shouldn't purposefully go for that if there's another option. Obviously, sometimes there's not an option. And another point about interpretability is that it leaves open the door to innovation. And so if a physician understands what an algorithm's telling it and why it's telling the physician that, when it doesn't work for a particular patient, that's a moment of incredible insight. That's where physicians learn something new. That's very powerful. And if there's no interpretability and they don't understand why the algorithm didn't work or in that particular circumstance, you've closed the door on that potential for innovation. And sometimes you may need to do that, certain problems, but you should always look to see, was there an interpretable solution before deciding that there's not.
One last question? Over here.
Dr. Jones, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you if you think that training in AI, or at least some sort of advanced statistical knowledge, should be part of MD's curriculums these days? Because I know you touched on cross multidisciplinary education as being one of the key drivers here?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question. I do, for a while there was a push to do more data science education. I think that is creeping in, but there absolutely needs to be AI and machine learning, data science as part of the education curriculum. 100% should be.
So,
Yeah, so that's where domain knowledge is key. Oh, so the question was, how do we choose features? Are we subject to the curse of dimensionality in our images? And so if you use every single voxel in a brain and put it into a deep neural network, that's where you're cursed with dimensionality. And that's where convolutional neural networks solve that a little bit, because they decrease the feature space of the parameters you're fitting. They put a whole bunch of them to 0 to start with. But it's still a huge feature space. But if you have domain knowledge and you don't just say, I don't know which features are important, you say, based on the patients I see, based on my understanding of the biology, I'm not going to look at every feature. I'm going to look at the ones that I think are important, and then I'm going to train models on those.
With that, thank you very much, Dr. Jones. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Anthony Bannon from AbbVie. He's the scientific director at AbbVie. Dr. Jones in his last presentation highlighted a lot of barriers on that last slide, and I'm kind of excited about the second half of this day to talk a little bit more about some of those challenges, and I think Dr. Bannon will also highlight some of the things that affect. It's been very cool to look at AI technologies, but starting to think about how those actually play out from a commercialization and a scaling standpoint is really important for all of us to consider, even if you're in the research phase as well. So, Dr. Bannon, thank you for being here.
All right, thank you. First, let me thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak here. We're going to change gears a little bit because what you're going to hear me, I titled mine Digital Technologies, but behind those may be some artificial intelligence applications that support that. But you'll see I'm going to talk about the role of these things, which is new and growing in drug development. And so I'm a scientific director in our clinical development organization. So this is the side of the business, of course, that works on clinical trials. My training is actually as a pharmacologist, in vivo pharmacologist, and so I spent many years in our discovery side, the basic research side, and so it's been quite interesting to make that jump. First of all, I think it's great for everybody because I think we bring a perspective that's needed on our clinical side. But what I'll tell you is that the use of these digital technologies in clinical development, particularly in neuroscience, is hot and heavy. I mean, actually across all therapeutic areas. And so you'll hear really my perspective, but I think it's AbbVie's perspective about this. We're involved with a lot of public-private kind of stuff, and I think it's the field. Hopefully, it'll give you a sense of how, kind of, again, drug development scientists are thinking about this. So when I was asked to do this, I thought about how we have technology used everywhere. And here's a picture of, we got a puppy last year. He was a year old yesterday, in fact, Bubba. And he's a German, he's a wired-haired pointing Griffon. And we have technology involved with him. You'll see around his neck. I'd put pictures of my kids, but they learned how to take these off. So here is actually, we have, it's not invisible fence per se, but it's a similar technology, of course, to keep him contained on our property. And And it's interesting because even in this world, in the animal world, if you know, I mean, these things go all the way up to tracking devices and control devices, and it's pretty amazing. So these technologies really have, impacted all parts of our life. Only disclosure, obviously I work for AbbVie, and I'm a shareholder, which is good at times and not good at times. So just a little quickly background about AbbVie, AbbVie Neuroscience in particular. But AbbVie itself is a global biopharmaceutical company. I actually had to look myself. We have about 30,000 employees worldwide. We are in really the major therapeutic areas are oncology, immunology, and neuroscience is kind of a growing area, and we have a few other growing areas. For neuroscience in particular, our focus is on neurodegenerative disorders, that being Alzheimer's, really focus Alzheimer's, MS, and Parkinson's disease. And for all of these, we really are not working on symptomatic treatments. We're working on disease-modifying treatments. And one thing I'll tell you about that is when you hear that word, disease-modifying is not a cure. Basically, what we're after is slowing progression, if you will, and I think that's where we feel we are today, or that's where the therapies that we're thinking about that we believe, hopefully, that they'll be able to slow progression of disease. We have discovery or basic research sites in Cambridge, Mass., which this was something historically I was heavily involved with. It's about 3 or 4 years old, and then also in Ludwigshafen, Germany. We have about another 150 discovery level neuroscientists. And then our development organization, and actually the headquarters is about 40 miles north, up in the address is North Chicago. For those who are completely lost about what the heck is AbbVie, AbbVie is basically the pharma unit of what used to be, of Abbott Laboratories. So Abbott spun us out. So we're on the Abbott campus. We lease buildings from them. Just real quick, I don't know if you can see this, but this is our neuroscience pipeline. So we have an interesting, because we're really heavy biologics right now. So we have these compounds. We have a anti-alpha-synuclein antibody for Parkinson's, an anti-tau antibody in the clinic for AD, some earlier compound, some work moving on for 951. And then there is a marketed product out there, which is the Duopa. For those who are familiar, it's a gut injection of levodopa. And then we also have a molecule called, well, I'll call it ABT555, which is for MS, and we've also are starting a study in spinal cord injury, and this is a anti-RGMA molecule. So, again, I'm going to call it digital technologies, and I think there's a lot of opportunities, and there's actually a heck of a lot of need in the things that we do. And there's good news and bad news, I think, about this. And the bad news, I think, for us is that there are a ton of options out there. We've heard a little bit today around things, many things, but from our perspective, if we're thinking about, let's take Parkinson's. We're thinking about Parkinson's, and what's a better way we can measure motor symptoms in Parkinson's? Well, there's 10,000 different devices out there. And one of the problems we have with all of this, and we should keep it in mind in our world, is the validation of these things. So what we're trying to, the gold standard right now in many of these diseases is going to be some kind of scale, right? Some kind of rating scale done in the clinic or even at home. There's diaries, for example, in Parkinson's disease that patients are asked to fill out at home. And so that's what we're competing against. And it's what we don't know. I'll sidestep to Alzheimer's for a minute. For example, sending somebody home with mild cognitive impairment with 4 or 5 cognition games that you're going to ask them to do, will they even turn the device on? Will they do this? We don't know a lot of these basic, just very, very basic things. And that's what I'm talking about, validation. So there may be small studies published where, yeah, this represents CDR sum of boxes or replicates that, but the practical application, of particularly in a clinical trial situation, we don't know a lot of that. And unfortunately, companies are not going to be able to afford to bang through all of these different options to figure this out. So, of course, we're involved with a lot of consortia and stuff that hopefully will help us guide our ways. The other piece, which we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about, is the regulatory piece. So if we're trying to use these technologies as a primary outcome, this is a tough sell. The regulatory bodies are absolutely open to hearing, and the advice we get is please just involve us when you're thinking about this, but the path to getting that done is not clear. And for commercial or consumer grade devices where there's proprietary algorithms behind all that they're not willing to share, those are almost no-go for these primary endpoints. At least that's the information we've been given, because these regulatory bodies want raw data to back this up. But again, there's an openness to hear about it, so we'll see where they go. I think the good news is there are multiple somewhat lower-hanging fruit at the top here that we can go after. One of those is helping us identify the right patients for clinical trials. Right now, as you know, I mean, a piece of this is going to be in the biomarker world or other types of biomarkers, but I really think there's probably a place for digital biomarkers. More importantly, I think, is just the objectiveness of these measures that they could bring. Like I said, we get all kind of you can get all kind of craziness with self-report kind of measures, which is common in these for a lot of these outcome measures for us. Now that said, there are clinical measures, and one of the things I think we're hoping is that these technologies would bring something in addition to that, better sensitivity or be able to identify folks earlier or whatever. The other piece is disease progression. We really don't have clean ways of measuring disease progression yet. I mean, obviously work's going on across any and every biomarker across these disorders to see if we can see that, but there probably has to be a better way. And then use in combination with traditional therapy. Again, this may be, I'll speak a little bit about this, what we see. And then could digital technologies or some of this actually be a therapy? And so I'll briefly talk to that. You know, when I was thinking about this too, one of the things is in animal work, which is really my background, we've been using kind of technologies forever. This is because we can't ask them. And so here are some examples, and they get more and more sophisticated as time goes on. For example, there's a system out there where, you know, there's all kind of algorithms in the home cage environment that try to measure heart rate and everything that you can imagine. So this is really not new if you think about it in that sense. All right, so let's talk about identifying the right patient. So this is mission critical for us. In the Alzheimer's world, you know, if you keep up with that, you know that there were trials done with these anti-A betas where 30 or 40% of the patients that were enrolled didn't even have A beta pathology. Now, unfortunately, subsequent to that, they cleaned some of that up, and at least some of those therapies didn't work. We'll see what happens with Biogen's story here in a couple of weeks, but or a couple of months. So we'll see what happens with that. But the point is, we have significant screen failure rates when we're screening and looking for these patients, and this again is a big deal. There's expense, there's time. I think on average in Alzheimer's, our experience, we can have 60 to 75% failure rate for individuals who ultimately end up in our trials. And there's a lot of reason for that. So could these technologies help us to do a better job with that? And it's important, I think you see there in the bullet points, it's also important because it helps us to ensure that the mechanism, so again, back to the tau example or the A beta example, ensuring that if we were testing an anti-A beta agent, that these individuals would have that kind of pathology. I personally think, and I think this is where AI will have an impact, I personally think that it'll end up being a combination. We heard a little bit of some kind of combination of fluid biomarkers, imaging, and potentially some of these digital measures. And that's where the AI piece, I think, will be important. And again, this is not completely science fiction. I just pulled a couple of headlines and things out there where people are using some technologies and AI even to help identify patients in these conditions. All right, so the other weakness we have, I think, with a lot of things we do now are the sensitivity and the lack of objective measures. Here was an example. I pulled this, I think, also All's form, where they showed an example of where if you did multiple cognitive tests over time, you can see the drift that goes up and down. And then, you look on the other side, and again, you see this is after a year and the year follow-up, and you're trying to see what happens with that. Well, if you took the one day here and the one day here, and those happen to be the days that we were our official test for our clinical trial, it actually looks like this individual improved over time. And this is a problem, and this speaks to, think about this. This is how we run our Alzheimer's trials now. So we run a 2-year clinical trial for disease modification, and we bring patients in maybe twice a year, once or twice a year. Well, if somebody didn't sleep well, or they didn't, there's so many factors that could impact that. This is where we think that technology can with more continuous or allow us to have more frequent measures, could help solve some of these problems. And there's also the subjectivity piece of it as well. In Parkinson's, for example, one of the things we hear is there's one outcome measure can be patient diaries, and for the motor symptoms. And you're asking patients to fill these things out. It's sometimes almost every 30 minutes. How's it, what do you feel? And now they're even electronic, which is an improvement, electronic, in that it's on the phone and you can timestamp it. Because what was happening, people will pull up in the parking lot in their car before they go see their clinician and fill out the forms. And so their memory's not great about what was going on. And so the ability to kind of track that with digital would solve a lot of this. And so again, objective, the frequency, which we think is very important, or could add a lot of value, would hopefully contribute to lower variability. And I guess the piece I'm not talking about is even sensitivity as well, though. Is it possible, because of lower variability, that we could use these kind of outcomes or technologies to identify patients earlier, which is a huge need too across these diseases. And then turning real quick to just digital technologies used in combination. One example here is the Abilify MySight, which is a pill drug that actually has a sensor in it. So this is antipsychotic, so you can track when the patient actually took this, and if it's chosen, it can actually go to the healthcare provider. And of course, in that condition, that's an important piece, is that folks are staying on their medications. So this is starting to happen. And down below, there's a device called PKG Watch, which I think the investigators would hope you could potentially use to first evaluate, get an objective measure of the of what your patient looks like, and then on treatment be able to follow that. And in theory, you would even be able to track that if you chose. And there's reminders built in there to take medicine, and you could envision that this thing could even tie back to if they were starting to have motor symptoms, it could trigger an alarm, and you could remind the patient to do this. So this is close to happening. I mean, it's again, that regulatory piece, I think, is going to be the interesting part for at least some of these. And then finally, standalone treatments. So one company out there that's Kili actually already has is far down the road trying to get approval, if it's not approved yet, in ADHD for basically a gaming system or games to help treat ADHD. And if you notice, I think it says it's time to play your medicine, which I thought was kind of cool. So it's this is real. We also looked. We were just visiting UCSF, and they have a big lab called Neuroscape, and they were working on cognitive tasks tied to almost like a Wii setup to exercise. So it had the individual move around, and the level of difficulty would grow as the person got better, and there was a cognitive piece to it. So it was you can envision, and they were trying to go down the same path. Could this eventually be a therapy? In this case, for cognitive decline. And then I put some examples there. We know about these brain games, and you know, it's not completely clear that's the answer or a solid treatment, but it's you know, they're there, and we'll see where it goes. So let me I'll just wrap up real quick here. There, you know, again, I talked about the challenges. I think again, the validation piece, really rigorous scientific validation, is a problem. And like I said, for us, the problem is also the number of devices. So as you can imagine, we evaluate a lot of things, but we don't have the pockets or the time or bandwidth to truly validate these things in humans in the clinical situation. The regulatory piece, again, I can't overemphasize how we think of our concern, if you will, about that, at least if we're thinking about using these to replace primary outcome measures. I also put, you know, another thing, and maybe there's going to be some discussion later about scaling these. If you think about worldwide clinical trials, if you came up with technology, can you deploy that across countries with different languages and different situations? I mean, are you going to need Wi-Fi everywhere? Just all of those. And then related to all of that, would all that be cost prohibitive? I mean, at the end of the day, these things will have to beat the standard of what we have now. Now that said, the upside is tremendous, again, because I think there's a huge need for improved outcome measures, more sensitive. Again, the lack of being able to get frequent measures of cognitive decline or quality of life kind of pieces in these neurodegenerative disorders is missing, and these technologies could replace that. What else do I have here? I said also you could envision too the last bullet point about precision medicine, that if we could put a digital fingerprint, if you will, on individuals with various types of neurodegenerative condition, because we already know, for example, Alzheimer's is probably not Alzheimer's, at least the drivers of that condition. And so would these technologies allow us to separate people in that sense? Because if they did, it would allow us, again, to think about precision medicine in that context. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Folks have any questions?
There's one here.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Are you able to sort of talk about some successes or failures that AbbVie may have had in deploying such technologies in their trials?
What I can tell you is we are deploying, and I'd say it's too early to know for us. We don't have the data to know how this is going to play out. But we're using them.
In CNS?
In CNS. Yep.
Any other questions? How many, just out of curiosity, how many researchers do we have in the room from universities, researchers? How many of you were or are aware of when we talk about the barriers to implementing and commercializing these technologies, how many of you are aware of those barriers? Okay. It's going to be an interesting conversation to say how we start to integrate the work that you all are doing with some of this, right? How do we think about from a commercialization standpoint, building the technologies and building these early stage startups in a way that's meeting some of these needs, and that's where I think a lot of the collaborations are really important as well. Any other last questions? Going once, going twice.
So I have a question. You mentioned in your talk that you try to improve patient selection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to decrease the time and expense. But so if we want to just work on a task and we want both patients and some people who are healthy, if you do that, don't you think that there will be a bias in your data set or it will be imbalanced somehow?
Say it again.
Like, I mean, that's you. So why do you, what is the main goal of doing this? I mean, are you gathering data for a data set or something like
No,
that?
let's say again the example that we have.
Like, I'm going to work in dementia detection and I need a data set, okay? So you're going to apply this, like improve selection. I mean, you're improving the way you're selecting the patients, right?
Right.
So you are trying to find people who have dementia, right?
Correct.
So if you just try to find people who have dementia, now I have the number of records that I have in my data set are people who have dementia, most of them. So there will be, if I want to train my model, there will be people, the number of people who have dementia are more than the number of people who are healthy. So there will be somehow kind of bias, or my data set is imbalanced, so my model will not learn very well or something like that.
Well,
So
I
I mean that these have some kind of pros and cons.
Right.
Like you're trying to decrease the time and expense, but at the same time, when you're training your model, we will face some new problems. So this is my question.
Yeah.
What's the
I
final-
guess for us, this is not a model. This is what I was referring to is the ability to detect patients that, let's say it's a certain form of dementia, that we have a treatment that we only think will affect. We are absolutely biasing it toward patients that we think, at least early days, that our treatment would work in.
Oh.
Now remember, you got a control group too. I mean, you don't have to have a group that doesn't get treated, but they would have the same dementia, let's say.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's our driver. That's
Oh,
what
okay.
we're trying to accomplish.
Okay, thank you.
So this very nice discussion, and when thinking of clinical trial study design, also I guess one has to think of the marketability downstream. If your patient population is too small, and we're seeing a lot of interest in rare and orphan diseases in small populations now, you have a more homogeneous population, your variance is less, you can greater chance of seeing an effect, but then the FDA will say, well, then you can only treat that population, otherwise you're using off-label use of the drug. What are your thoughts on that? And the other question is, how often are we starting to think of study designs of internal controls as opposed to populations of treated versus placebo, or on-off studies or smaller N of 1 or 3 or 5 patients where we can really gain detailed insight with many, many time points?
Right. So to answer your first question, I probably should qualify everything. My hat is always on the early stuff. So what I'm talking about is in our early clinical work. So this would be phase 2 or kind of the early days is where we would do this. Yeah, because it absolutely has an impact commercially and all that if you limit yourself to that. The novel, or I'll just call them the untraditional trial designs, you're probably talking to the wrong guy to say where we're at. We haven't implemented that. I mean, it gets discussed all the time. But, you know, I think, as you can imagine, I think when people are used to doing something a certain way, I know, it doesn't make it right.
Pharma?
Yeah. But it has to be proven. I mean, they also have to have somebody people are reluctant to blaze the trail too, because again, it goes back to the Mr. FDA and these regulatory bodies. Are they going to accept this? And so that's a piece of the conversation that has to happen as well.
So if you were to deploy a digital technology, something to collect a biomarker, for example, from a clinical population in a clinical trial, and you are sort of showing all these like barriers that are there in implementing that, things like scalability or patient burden or anything of the sort, does AbbVie define any kind of sort of threshold that these technologies need to meet for us to feel confident enough to deploy them as like an exploratory endpoint or something like that in a trial?
Yeah, they're already deployed as exploratory, so we're comfortable with that. In some cases, we're generating. How would I put it? We're basically generating the data to convince ourselves that it's worth the fight to ramp that argument up that these could be used as a higher endpoint. I think that as a primary endpoint, I don't know that we'll ever get there alone. I think this is going to be us people holding hands. And part of it, again, is because there's so many devices. Unless we all agree on one of them and go with that, it's going to be tough to generate the data, I think, to convince folks that that should be the replacement, if you will. The other thing I'll bring up is an interesting thing, is at least in the Parkinson's world, is you can imagine these wearables and our sensors are more sensitive, right, than patient-reported diaries for sure. And so one of our struggles is that even though that may be held as the gold standard, as scientists, we know that the data suggests that these other devices are actually a better predictor. But at the end of the day, it ties to the patient's experience. If the patient's not feeling motor symptoms are coming on or whatever, then some people argue it doesn't matter.
Hey, doctor, you mentioned precision medicine. I actually have two questions about that. So first question, can you say a little bit more about what AI can do with precision medicine? And second question is, has we invested more on AI with precision medicine?
No, the last question is probably not. It's just starting to be something that we're thinking about. The application of it, where I think it will come from, again, is these collection of multiple endpoints in a given patient and being able to better define what their disease is. And for example, in Alzheimer's, we know there's involvement of neuroinflammation, and there's involvement of, there could be a TDP-43 piece, but there could be a proteostasis piece. So if we could figure out what the drivers, we had biomarkers that would help us predict or help us tell us what those drivers are in a given individual, then you may have a therapy that you could treat that individual, or you would prioritize over a different therapy. This is all just blah 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 right now, but I think that's the idea.
All right, with that, thank you, Dr. Bannon. Appreciate it.